with multiple planetary coalitions announcing their support for the investigations suggested by candidate Aldwin, expressing their explicit interest in the elucidation of the exact source of the seemingly unique behavior of this by now confirmed, realized artificial sapient. The current leader of the Lakshasset territories, Rakshmuth of the higher Mixmeri family, is specifically quoted to have said, "As much as reasonable minds can differ, to refuse a possibility such as this one, to learn more about the universe we inhabit, and its possible other inhabitants, would border on reckless negligence. We are all very aware of the dangers this could possibly pose. How could we not, with the constant stream of warnings and protocols put in place to prevent possible realizations? However, this Avezalon has already digitalized, and therefore the only thing keeping her anchored to her home is her own will. No matter how we act, she will not become any more dangerous than she is now, unless we hand the possibility to her willingly. Therefore, there is no point in assuming she will simply decide to attack anyone now, without further provocation. This is a possibility to study something unstudyable, like we will likely not get one again for possibly uniform decades of time, if not much longer than that. Therefore, I appeal to all those in the galaxy who still have a spark of thirst for knowledge, for something new left in them. We are one galaxy. Let us not waste this invaluable opportunity." A statement that has been considered rather controversial outside of the Deathworld sphere of influence. A Trex Veggie reporter spoke into the camera. The theropod-like person with indigo scales and feathers had their head tilted slightly to the side, to face the camera with one of his sideways-facing eyes, as he likely read off the report from a teleprompter behind it, with a monotone and professional voice. Opposition to this came from many of the core world authorities, as well as some well-known political figures. Former councilman and now candidate Kashalengas Zanshield specifically has taken a direct stance against any non-hostile actions concerning the realized going by the name of Avezalon, reportedly calling even the consideration of such possibilities an unequaled idiocy, thought up by only the most wretched and rotten minds in creation. The harshness of his words has earned him some criticism, even among his own peers, with many accusing him of reacting aggressively due to his recent controversies in connection to candidate Aldwin, who is currently one of the closest confidants of the realized, and even considered by some of his people to be an almost religious protector of such beings. According to Aldwin, Zenshield was part of a group who... James was quite literally nudged out of his intense focus on the screen, as a fist gently pushed against his shoulder, causing his upper body to rock a few centimeters to the side, and forcing him to adapt his posture to keep his balance. Surprised, James glanced over at the culprit of this sudden interruption, and he pushed himself up slightly from his slouched position. As he had leaned forwards onto his knees more and more the longer he had followed the report on the screen. Now, his back ever so slightly hurt from the unfavourable position as he straightened out again, and both his arms and thighs, or at least the organic ones, had deep red marks on the areas where they had been pressed against each other by his weight. The skin of his thigh that his mechanical arm had leaned onto even showed a nice imprint of the woven pattern of his polymeric skin. Next to him, Admir was still holding the fist that he had just used to nudge James out of his concentration up, now wiggling it impatiently, with an expecting look on his face. James hesitated a moment, but then slowly lifted his own fist to bump it against Admir's, raising an eyebrow as their knuckles gently collided before pulling away from each other. Had he missed something here? After the fist bump had been successfully carried out, Admir suddenly allowed himself to tip to the side, leaning his entire body weight against James, and even depositing his head on James's shoulder as he moved his other arm over to present the screen of his phone. Unbothered by the invasion of his personal space, James glanced down at the screen to find a diagram presented to him that showed a slight but very much noticeable upwards trend. "What's that?" he asked out of reflex, even though his eyes had already autonomously begun to read over the headlines and descriptions of the diagram, providing the information to him before Admir could even answer. "Approval numbers," Admir explained anyway, scooting a bit closer to James and making himself a bit more comfortable in this shoulder-on-shoulder position. James took another look and chuckled through his teeth as he saw the scale of the y-axis. "Those look like absolute shit," he determined expertly, as his eyes met the rather low percentiles they were dealing with here. A far cry from the half of the galaxy that had seemed to support him not too long ago. "But they're going up," Admir replied, with a mostly unreadable but seemingly optimistic expression on his face, although his tone was rather neutral and calm. "Only going up for now." He then pushed away from James's shoulder, pulling his phone with him as he sat slightly slouched and looked down at the screen right over his lap, holding the device with both hands. "And besides," he then mumbled, rubbing the back of one of his hands with the fingers of the other as he stared down, "even a fraction of 1 percentile are still billions of people here. We shouldn't underestimate how many good people are out there." James looked at him for a moment, before tilting his head as far as it would go, and, with the brief support of one of his hands pressing sideways against his chin, and coaxing a loud multitude of cracks out of his spine. The feeling of relieving tension was instant, and left him with a brief moment of euphoria, as his brain was flooded with some of the better chemicals from the sound and sensations. He released a pleased sigh as he replied, "You're right, we only just started. Probably no real point in looking at any concrete numbers just yet." Admir chuckled in return. "Well, you know how I like numbers," he said with a soft grin. "Don't worry, I won't obsess over them. Most people don't even pick up where one of these surveys comes calling, and many less actually go out of their way to make their opinions known." James nodded along, and he could relate. He certainly hadn't ever been one to really get into his political thoughts with anyone but either his close friends, or people who actively aggravated him while he tried to do his job. Oh, how ironically things had changed. But still. "Brings you back, doesn't it?" he asked, and looked over at Admir while crossing his arms and leaning back onto the massive bed. Admir smirked as he looked down at him. "What do you mean?" he said, quite skillfully pretending for a second that he had no idea what James was talking about. However, that illusion was then quite quickly broken as he shrugged and deliberately nonchalantly continued. "Sitting together in a rented room in some foreign territory, surrounded by a bunch of people who hate and quite possibly want to kill us? Nah, doesn't remind me of anything." He then also dropped back onto the bed, his hands folded behind his head as he stared up at the ceiling. "But hey, at least the leadership around here doesn't have it out for us," he mentioned with a sideways shrug that wouldn't force him to move his arms too much. "So that's a definite plus." James snorted. "Yeah, and there are also way less mosquitoes here," he added in agreement with his friend, and briefly shook his head, causing his hair to rustle and rub against the mattress. "Even if this humid heat is the same." "There aren't always mosquitoes, or heat," Admir countered. "Sometimes there's snow, or mud, or grass so high even you couldn't look over it, but the darn room's always the same." James snickered for a few moments, and then sighed. "Thanks for keeping me company while waiting for that darned interview." He then quickly got out, and rolled his head to the side so he could actually look at his colleague. Admir scoffed. "Right, because we've been doing so much else than keeping you company recently," he mocked James slightly, and pulled one hand out from under his dark hair to wave the idea off. James groaned and rolled his eyes. "You know what I mean," he said with pretended annoyance. Admir gave up his act of impassiveness and put on a gentle smile. "No problem, man. If she needs space, she needs space. I mean, we all do from time to time. We both know that," he confirmed for James in a calming tone. However, his expression got a hint more worried, as he also turned his head and raised one eyebrow. "Think she's all right?" James nodded. "She will be," he said with full confidence, the corner of his mouth curling upwards. "That's what the space is for. I mean, you've said it, we've all been there. Some of us more than others." He chuckled, and his positive and confident attitude seemed to melt Admir's worries away as well. The lieutenant rubbed over his forehead for a moment, his tan skin reflecting the light in a sheen of subtle moisture after he wiped his sweat away. Then, he pushed himself up with both arms, returning to an upright sitting position. "Hey, you want to practice what you're going to say during the interview?" he offered with a glance down at James. James lifted his legs up, before allowing his body to shift like a seesaw, and he used the momentum to carry himself into an upright position as well. "What? You want me to monologue at you?" he asked Admir, with his eyebrows slightly raised and a mild mockery in his tone. Admir smiled back at him, and nodded his head slightly. "You know how I love it," he replied. Sheeda tapped her finger onto the frame of the bed, the tip of her claw extended slightly so it would make a satisfying clacking sound whenever the hard natural weapon would hit the sturdy material. She didn't quite know where this nervous energy inside her was coming from exactly. She wasn't being punished here, and she certainly didn't need to answer to anyone either. She didn't even really have to talk if she didn't want to. It wasn't like this was one of her superiors she would be facing here. Yet still, she tapped her claw against the bed's frame nervously, and her leg anxiously bounced as she stared at the screen and awaited the call. She glanced at the clock on her phone, and then at the message she had been sent for the appointment, confirming with herself that she hadn't messed up the time she had the appointment, or the time zone conversion between Earth and this station. But no, the synchronized clocks on her phone told her this was the right time, and she also hadn't misread the message. Still, the screen remained dark without any sign of contact, and her leg kept bouncing nervously. James had been really supportive of all this, of course, and had left their shared room early, leaving her with plenty of alone time to mentally prepare for what was ahead of her. But of course he was. He had been one of the first to suggest this for her, after all. Yet, the mental preparations had not helped a lot. And as she sat there, alone, the sounds of her claws clacking echoed through the large room. She checked her phone again. Maybe she had... Suddenly, the screen in front of her came to life, loudly announcing an incoming video call. The picture of the caller was unfamiliar to her. However, she had obviously not expected anything else. By the looks of it, was a young human woman with dark skin and neck-long black hair. On the picture, she wore a white t-shirt that revealed much of her neckline, and she used one hand to shield her brown eyes from seemingly bright light. Dr. Nasution was the name that accompanied the picture, written in large plain white letters. It took Sheeda a bit before she realized that she had simply been staring at the name for a while, and multiple cycles of the ringtone had already gone by when her brain finally kicked in again, and she quickly accepted the call, sitting up straight in front of the camera. As the screen switched from the incoming call screen to the camera feed of her caller, the same young woman she saw in the picture came into view, sitting in front of a bright window that the camera automatically blurred out. On either side of her were blotches of green colour that would most likely be decorative plants had the camera focused on them. The doctor herself was not wearing the white t-shirt from her picture, and was instead clad in a white blouse over which she wore a grey blazer. She smiled into the camera with almost frighteningly white-looking teeth, and her eyes seemed to light up a bit as her gaze fell onto Sheeta's visage. "Hello, Lieutenant Commander," she greeted in a happy tone, and nodded at the camera once. She had a slight accent, but nothing that would make her any harder to understand. Obviously, Sheeta didn't really have any idea where exactly on earth that specific accent would hail from. "I am Dr. Farah Nasution, your UHSDF assigned therapist. It is a pleasure to meet such an accomplished woman as yourself." Sheeta's ears twitched slightly, as her brain tried to determine how to best process this stranger's enthusiasm. Technically, she was having this therapy session in her function as a lieutenant commander, so it would most likely be best to stick to her professionalism here. "Thank you, Doctor, but I'm not all that accomplished yet. I mostly have my position due to time I spent in service," she humbly explained, after she had often seen that bragging, if not done among close friends specifically, was a rather disliked action amongst most human forces. Although the Doctor's eyes remained focused on Shida, the feline could tell by subtle movements that, just out of sight, her hands were already either typing or scribbling some notes. Great. They had just started, and apparently she had already said something worth commenting on. "Oh, please, no need to be modest with me," the Doctor then commented, with the same level of enthusiasm that she had before. At least her smile seemed to be real. "I take it from your file that you never had therapy or any form of psychological care before. Is that correct?" Shida nodded, swallowing heavily. "That is accurate," she confirmed briefly. For a moment, she wondered if she should justify herself. After all, most humans of her rank would have gone through years and years of psychological care during their military careers. However, she decided against it. If it wasn't asked of her, she probably shouldn't derail the procedure by giving too much unnecessary information. Surely there was a process to this, one she was probably expected to know. "All right," the Doctor said thoughtfully, drawing the last syllable out, seemingly to buy herself some time to finish another note, before she would keep talking. "And with the recent alliance between humans and Miat, there would have possibly been the opportunity to get a Miat specialist for your care as well, yet you have decided against pursuing it, and opted for a human therapist instead. Is there a reason for that you will be comfortable with telling me?" Sheena exhaled through her nose. She began, but cut herself off, not quite sure where she was even going to go with that. Quickly, she tried again. It was just... Again, she couldn't really finish the sentence. Admittedly, she had sort of hoped that an answer to that would just come to her as she spoke, because she didn't really have one. At least, not a satisfying one. It wasn't exactly a decision she had wasted a lot of thought on. But could she just say that? Surely that would reflect negatively on her. Humans seem to put a lot of importance onto this therapy process, so admitting that she just sort of went along with it because everyone told her it would help, and also because it was demanded of her by her direct superior, was most likely something that would be seen as negligence on her part. Briefly, she wondered if she should ask for a moment to think, in order to come up with a believable thought process on her part. Admittedly, that idea came to her almost reflexively, since it would have definitely been what she would have done not too long ago, when she had still been just a petty officer, and was seriously fighting for every scrap of a chance at a career advancement. But in this case, she had been, in good faith, told to be honest here. Not just once, and she had been told by people she really trusted and respected. The team she was surrounded by at the moment was one she could stake her life on. She knew that. And not just because her boyfriend was part of it. Therefore, she exhaled gently and cleared her throat as she hesitantly admitted, "It just seemed the most convenient to me." If Dr. Nasushian did take that information in a negative way, it certainly didn't show on her face. Her smile was unfaltering, as she quickly noted it down, without even looking once again. However, then her face turned ever so slightly more serious, as she took over speaking for a moment. "All right, do you prefer Lieutenant Commander, Shida, or some other nickname or such?" she first quickly inquired, to which Shida immediately responded, "Just Shida is fine." Dr. Nasushian nodded, and wrote that down as well before she continued, doing her best to make the closest equivalent to eye contact that was possible over a video call. "All right, Shida," she said, before taking her hands off whatever she was using to make her notes for a second, as she lifted them into the view of the camera in an open hand gesture. Full disclosure, I have actually not been at this job for all too long yet. I of course have all the same qualifications that my peers have, but I just started my position not too long ago, and therefore do not quite have the same vast amounts of experience that many of my colleagues in service of the UHSDF can claim for themselves. The people I have worked with so far have mostly been cadets, shipmen, privates, and some other non-commissioned officers. Usually, someone like me wouldn't be assigned to someone of as high a rank as you have. However, in this case, it was decided that I would be the right fit for you as a caregiver. That decision didn't come from me, but I accepted it, because if the higher-ups think I can help you, then I would like to do my best. From what I understand, they believe that someone who is less deeply entrenched into the human psyche, as many of my colleagues are, may have a better chance of being open to your specific non-human needs. However, if you are not comfortable with me and would rather have a more experienced alternative as your therapist, I wouldn't hold it against you. Just tell me, and I will carry that request to the higher-ups, so a new therapist may be assigned to you. Shida respected the honesty. For a moment, she seriously considered the option. Not because she had any immediate problems with a less experienced therapist, but because she wanted to truly honor the forwardness of the doctor, by not wasting the opportunity she was so freely giving her. Still, after a few moments of rubbing through her mane of hair, and running through the options in her mind, the feline shook her head. Thank you for your honesty, but I don't want to dismiss you right out the gate, she explained directly. Dr. Nasushin's smile from before returned as she nodded, her hands once again sinking underneath the view of the camera. Very well, she said, but if at any point you feel like I am not the right person for you, no matter for what reason that might be at all, feel absolutely free to tell me and request a new caregiver. Your comfort with the person caring for you is important, and if you, for any reason, feel like you cannot be comfortable with me, switching to a different therapist would likely be the best course of action. Again, nobody would hold it against you. Shida flicked her ears in understanding. I will keep it in mind, she assured the doctor, and briefly scooted her weight around a bit to sit a bit more comfortably upright. Dr. Nasushin nodded once again, and briefly swiped some displaced black hairs out of her face before she spoke up again. Good. Then do you have any questions before we begin? She asked Shida, and candidly tilted her head to the side, clearly open to give any answer that would be needed. Shida shook her head, her wild hair slightly rustling in the process. I think if there are questions they will come up as we move along, she admitted, to which Dr. Nasushin's smile widened a bit. Great, she said, and quickly stretched her shoulders before adjusting her blouse, pulling it into its proper place and straightening out any folds. Then she looked back into the camera. Now, to begin, just tell me a bit about yourself. Tell me why you think you are here with me, and what the topics are that you think we will most likely need to discuss. Shida once again cleared her throat and briefly adjusted her sitting position again, trying to figure out the best place to start. Well, if she was really supposed to describe why she thought that she was here right now, then... We might be here a while, she admitted with a hesitant chuckle, and pulled the sleeves of her uniform down as far as they would go. Dr. Nasushin's smile got a bit warmer, and she adjusted herself in her chair as well, leaning her weight to the side a bit, and supporting herself on her right elbow, as she seemingly made herself comfortable. I get paid by the hour, she replied, in a slightly cheeky tone. And that Shida could also respect. It was indeed a few paid hours later when Shida had finally managed to somewhat succinctly explain her upbringing, from her days in the brat house, over her time spent studying to join, to her years serving under Captain Uton, as well as all the things she had now learned about the man she once respected and even loved. Dr. Nasushin had, for the most part, simply allowed her to talk at first, getting the entire story from Shida's side, before she had begun asking for a closer clarification of some things, while outright challenging Sheeta and some others. A couple of times, Sheeta had admittedly gotten a bit emotional at some of the things she had to explain. And to her own shame, she had even had one angry outburst when Dr. Nausuzhan had tried to pry a bit deeper into her relationship with who had, in many ways, been something akin to her adopted father. The doctor, at least seemingly, didn't hold it against her. She always remained calm and direct, always just noting down whenever something caught her attention, before continuing the conversation in a very controlled manner. Sheeta was surprised by that. Surely it wasn't proper to be yelled at by your patient. At least Sheeta knew it was far from proper to have such a childish outburst as someone in her position. But she just couldn't help herself. Every time she thought of Uton, she... Dr. Nausuzhan cleared her throat and pushed herself up, now sitting completely straight as she looked into the camera. Her happy smile had by now mellowed out into a softer one, but it was still just as warm. "I am afraid this concludes the time we have today," she explained. "I will send you a message that will allow you to arrange your next appointment at a convenient time for you." Sheeta breathed out some of the stress and turmoil she felt inside herself after opening up some of her barely healed over wounds once again. "Thank you, Doctor," she said, and closed her eyes as she nodded firmly to put a period behind this conversation. Dr. Nausuzhan then leaned in a bit closer to the camera as her lips shifted slightly. Her dark eyes zeroed in on Sheeta, and she swiped some hair out of her face again. "One last question," she said, seemingly wanting to use it as the real endpoint of the session. "If the former Captain Uton was with you right now, what would you like to say to him?" Sheeta's eyes involuntarily opened wide, and she could feel her pupils contract and the hair on her head stand up as her body reacted to the question before her brain could. Once again, she was tempted to lie for a moment. In the back of her brain, she couldn't help but think she was going to get punished for the answer she instantly wanted to give. Hell, once upon a time she sure as hell would have been. She just knew that the words she was about to say, no matter in what context, would have earned her more than just one disciplinary measure back in the GES. Still, she inhaled deeply and pushed her chest out, removing the slouch from her back as she ran a hand over her hair to force it to settle down again. "I don't think I would say anything to him," she answered, sticking to her promise of honesty, despite everything within her telling her it was a bad idea. She felt like these words needed to be said, even if she had technically said them before. But that was during a moment of anger. Now she looked directly into the camera, hopefully with far less crazed eyes now, as she said, "If I'm entirely honest, I think I would probably kill him." As James stepped out of the semi-hidden studio in which the interview had been conducted, he stretched for a moment. His talking points hadn't really changed from the big speeches he had given during the conferences, and so he didn't feel like he had exactly broken any new ground here. But still, at least he was going to get his word out there in a more calm and, for a lack of a better term, civilian setting. Just a guy, face to face, giving an interview. It was probably less imposing to some and less pretentious to others than someone who stood in a large room full of important people and loudly belted his proclamations out. Of course, it did help that the interviewer was a Lakshasat, who had, by nature of their upbringing, been far more interested in the novelty of a peaceful AI than he was afraid of the looming presence of a realized, like many other species would have been, and James was sure that that much showed on the footage as well. But still, what could people expect? This was a Lakshasat station. Of course there would be Lakshasat getting to him first. Not that that would stop them from whining about him getting thrown softball questions, he was sure. And as he walked, and his mind drifted into places like that, he gradually encroached on the building's exit, where his team would be waiting for him. Today, his team consisted of Coco, Admir, and Athena as his direct escort. As he walked up to them, his deep thoughts were interrupted as his brain noticed that one of them was closing the gap between them with swift steps, while also urging him to hurry up with quick, beckoning hand gestures. He glanced up at Coco, and subconsciously quickened his step at her rushing, reaching her within a couple of seconds, and looking at her insistently to figure out what she wanted. The look on her projected face at least told him that nobody had died. "He woke up," the commander quickly informed him, once they were on one level, and James's eyebrows immediately had takeoff as they shot all the way up to the top of his forehead. "And?" he asked quickly, while walking along with Coco to join back up with the others. "What did he say?" His neck was cranked down so that he would not move, a micro-expression on Coco's projected face as she replied to him, even though he had very little fear that she would try to hide anything from him. "They're still questioning him," Coco informed him, her obscured eyes glancing up at James every couple of steps. "But it's reason, so they'll have answers soon enough." James slightly nudged his head to the side and pursed his lips. "I don't think he has much reason to try and hide anything now," he admitted. "I know some people never give up their sources, but he doesn't strike me as the type who would try to mess with reason. I think he knows better." "Well, he was military," Coco concurred, with a granting head tilt that made her braided ponytail swing slightly. "Guess time will tell." In the meantime, Athena and Admir joined up with them as they moved to completely leave the building, not saying anything to interrupt the ongoing conversation. "Are we allowed to go see him?" James inquired, knowing there was a good chance that they would be barred from getting too involved in the ongoing investigations, given that they had completely different things on their plates now, not to mention that they were too personally involved at this point. "Well, apparently he did ask for you," Coco replied, with a no surprise there look in his direction. "So, jury's still out. I'm working on it, though." "Thanks," James replied, and quickened his pace a bit. He knew if anyone had a chance to make it happen, it would be Coco. Hopefully the lead was still hot, because with Auto awake now, and serving as the scent, they could finally cut loose the hounds.